Hey folks, Bot here. Today we're closing out this whole series the same way you'd close a case file, by laying every piece of evidence on the table and asking you one simple question. Who really was Jesus of Nazareth? So let's start where any good investigation starts. The basics. Who, when, where. Jesus was a Jewish rabbi born sometime in the final years of a king named Herod the Great, who we know historically died around 4 BC. During this time, Israel wasn't its own independent nation, but one of the many occupations governed by imperial Rome. That's actually one of the easier anchor points in ancient history. Historians use Herod's death as a fixed marker, and the 4 gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, place Jesus' birth right before it. So we're talking about the very end of the 1st century before Jesus' birth, give or take a couple years depending on how you're counting. Now here's where it gets interesting, and I don't mean interesting in a, neat trivia kind of way. Jesus didn't just claim to be a Jewish rabbi. No. He also claimed to be the Son of God and the Savior whom God had promised would deliver the Jewish people when the Lord initially made a covenant of sanctification with their great ancestor Abraham centuries ago. This self-made proclamation would see him arrested, trialed, and eventually executed through the Roman method of crucifixion at the age of 33. So we pretty much got the basics down on who he was and whom he claimed to be. So the follow-up question is another simple one. Was his proclamation true, and why do billions of people after his death still believe it to be the case? Well, that requires us to dig a bit deeper into the history books, and that's honestly where things get even more interesting. See, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, small town, nothing special about it economically or politically, but it was David's hometown. Yep, the ancestral city of the Israelite king who wrote a good portion of Psalms. And if you've been with us through that whole Psalm series, you already know. Old Dave wasn't just a guy with a harp and a sling. No. Dave was the template, the standard every future king got measured against. So when the gospel writers tell you Jesus was born in Bethlehem, they're not giving you a cute detail for a Christmas pageant. They're filing a credential. They're saying, this birthplace lines up with what the prophets said the Messiah's lineage required. Jesus grew up, though, not in Bethlehem, but up north in Nazareth, in a region called Galilee. It's working class, it's diverse, it's got fishermen and farmers and tradesmen, and it sat right next to a city called Sepphoris that Herod's son was rebuilding into a glittering Roman showpiece at the time. So picture growing up in the shadow of imperial construction. New roads, new architecture, Roman money flowing in, while you're a kid in a peasant family down the road. That's the world Jesus grew up watching. When his ministry actually started, historians can place that pretty precisely too. Luke tells us it lined up with, quote, the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, and we can cross-check that against other historical records of when Tiberius took power. That puts the start of his public ministry around the late 20s AD. And depending on which gospel you're tracking, that ministry ran somewhere between 1 and 3 years before it ended in Jerusalem. Here's the geography real quick, because it matters later. Jesus' home base for ministry was Capernaum, up on the Sea of Galilee, a hub for trade and fishing, lots of foot traffic, lots of different kinds of people passing through. From there, he moved through Galilee, then down into Judea and Samaria. And that southward movement is what eventually put him in direct, face-to-face contact with the people who ran Jerusalem. Religious leaders, temple authorities, and eventually Rome itself. So that's the skeleton. Real birthplace, real timeline, real geography you could still walk today. None of that's a matter of faith. That's just history. The question this whole lesson is built around is what he did inside that timeline that turned a peasant rabbi from Galilee into a man Rome felt the need to crucify. But before we get there, folks, we need to talk about who's actually telling us this story. Because if the evidence is shaky, nothing else matters. So here's something that trips a lot of people up. And honestly, it tripped my engineer up when he first started processing it. There's not one biography of Jesus. There's 4. We mentioned them before, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And skeptics love to point at the differences between them like it's a smoking gun. Like, see? They don't even agree on the details. Must be made up. But that's backwards, folks. That's backwards in basically every other field of historical and legal investigation. Multiple independent witnesses describing the same event, with some variation in detail but consistency on the core facts, is exactly what real testimony looks like. If 4 people watched the same car accident and gave you 4 word-for-word identical statements down to the comma, you wouldn't trust that. You'd assume they got together and rehearsed it. The differences are what tell you nobody's reading off the same script. So let's look at what each of these 4 witnesses actually brings to the table, because they're not redundant. They're complementary. Matthew's a disciple writing for a Jewish audience, and he was able to connect Jesus back to Old Testament prophecy. Every chance he gets, Matthew's pointing at the Davidic line, the prophetic fulfillment, the "this happened so that what was spoken might be fulfilled" pattern. Matthew's basically building the legal case file, connecting Jesus to the promises made centuries earlier. Mark's the action guy. Fast pace, short sentences, focused on what Jesus did and what he suffered. A lot of historians think Mark is documenting the recollections of another disciple of Jesus named Peter. Like this is the raw footage, the unedited field report from somebody who was actually there. Then there's Luke, the historian's historian. He actually tells you up front, in his own opening lines, that he interviewed eyewitnesses and put together what he calls an orderly account. Luke gives you the most detail on dates, on Roman officials like Pilate, on the wider social reach of the movement, especially to people on the margins. So that's one misconception of the Bible that people who've never read it oftentimes make. It doesn't read like a fairy tale, starting with once upon a time. It was written the way a report or a documentary would have been written during that time. And then there's the Gospel of John, my engineer's personal favorite depiction of the Gospels, different from all 3. John, another disciple, isn't trying to give you a chronological biography. He's already assuming you know the basic story. John's asking a deeper question. Who is this guy? John gives you the inside conversations, the one-on-one dialogues. If Mark's the action report, John's the philosophical interview you're meant to follow up afterwards. And here's the part that actually matters for our case, where these 4 accounts line up tightest and historians consider the most secure. The arrest, the trial before Pilate, the crucifixion, the discovery of an empty tomb. That's the bedrock. That's where 4 independent sources, writing for 4 different audiences with 4 different priorities, all land on the same ground. So now we've got a real person, a real timeline, and 4 credible, if imperfectly overlapping, witnesses. Which brings us to the next question this whole thing hinges on. What did this Jesus guy do that turned him from a regional teacher into Rome's problem? See, folks, here's the thing. Jesus didn't accidentally end up on a cross by stumbling into trouble. If you trace the timeline carefully, he systematically, deliberately provoked the 2 most powerful institutions in his world. Let's walk through it. So, Phase 1 happens up in Galilee, and on the surface it looks like healing ministry, which, fine, that's not controversial on its own. But buried inside some of those healing stories is something Jesus says that absolutely was controversial. He claims the authority to forgive sins. And in first century Jewish thought, that's not a small claim. Atonement happens through the temple system. Full stop. So when some random traveling rabbi starts telling people their sins are forgiven, without an altar, without a priest, without a sacrifice, that's not a nice gesture. That's a direct challenge to the entire religious establishment's reason for existing. Add to that constant friction with religious leaders over Sabbath law. And again, this isn't Jesus just being a rebel for the sake of it. He's claiming the authority as the Son of Man to fulfill the sacred law itself. That's escalating tension number 1. Phase 2 is where it gets loud. 3 years into his ministry, Jesus deliberately enters Jerusalem during Passover, the single most volatile week of the entire Jewish calendar, a holiday literally celebrating Israel's liberation from imperial oppression. And what does he do once he's there? He walks into the temple courts and flips over the tables of the money changers. This is not a quiet protest, folks. This is a public disruption of the temple's actual economy, the financial engine that funded the high priest's entire operation. Now, Jesus was already proving to be a thorn in the religious leaders' side by this point, and they were desperately waiting for Jesus to do anything they could use to get rid of him. Why? Because he was a political agitator who not only undermined their authority, but was also riling up quite the follower base that believed he'd deliver them from the rule of Rome and restore Israel's kingdom. And, well, Jesus never said anything about restoring a kingdom here on earth, but we'll get to that. So phase 3 is the trap. Religious leaders try to corner him with a no-win question once he makes a mess of things in their temple. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Say yes, and he alienates everyone, hoping for liberation from Rome. Say no, and he's openly inciting rebellion against the empire. And Jesus just sidesteps the whole trap entirely. Render to Caesar what's Caesar's, render to God what's God's. But buried in that answer is something massive. He's just publicly stated that Rome's authority is subordinate to God's kingdom. That's all the religious leaders need. Now they've got ammunition to paint him as a threat to Roman interests too. So, here's the thing, folks. If this man had this much evidence stacked up against him, religious leaders furious, Roman sensitivities triggered, his own popularity making any public arrest downright impossible since it'd cause a riot on a nightmare scale that'd get the religious figureheads in trouble with the Roman overlords, why would he keep rattling the cages in Jerusalem instead of backing off? And the answer the Gospels give consistently across all 4 witnesses is that he wasn't avoiding the collision. He was choosing it. This wasn't a strategy that failed. This was the mission all along. Which brings us to Judas Iscariot. And folks, I think we owe him a real beat here, not just a footnote. Like Matthew, Peter, and John, Iscariot was one of the 12 disciples. Not a bystander, not a late convert, an inner circle guy, trusted enough to handle the group's money. So whatever drove him to flip wasn't some outsider's grudge. It was somebody close enough to watch the whole thing up close and still decide to walk away. Now, the Gospels don't give us a tidy psychological profile. They give us the events and let you sit with them. Many historians would suggest Judas was like so many of the Jews, believing Jesus would deliver them from Roman rule and serve as a military figurehead. And when Jesus made it clear he was here to serve a heavenly kingdom, we humans couldn't see, things went sour with him quickly. That's just one hypothesis, but whatever the motivation was, the results were the same. 30 pieces of silver changes hands, so greed is clearly part of the picture. But historians and commentators have also pointed at something deeper, sitting underneath that. Disillusionment. If Judas was hoping for the kind of Messiah who'd raise an army and throw Rome out of Judea by force, and instead he's watching Jesus talk about turning the other cheek and entering Jerusalem on a donkey instead of a war horse, that's a pretty brutal letdown for somebody who signed up for a revolution. We don't get to read his mind. But greed and disappointed expectations aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes those two things just feed each other, you know? Okay? Whatever the exact mix of motive was, here's the function he served, historically speaking. The religious authorities had a logistics problem. Jesus was too popular to arrest in public during Passover without risking a riot, but Judas solves that problem. He knows where Jesus resides at night, away from the crowds, a garden called Gethsemane. Judas doesn't just betray a friend, he provides the surgical, low-visibility arrest that makes the whole plan executable. From there, it moves to Jesus being arrested and taken to the Roman prefect or governor of the region named Pontius Pilate. He was a Roman of the equestrian class. That's the rank just below the senatorial aristocracy, basically the professional administrative class Rome drew its provincial governors from. He was appointed prefect of Judea around 26 AD by Tiberius Caesar, and he held that post until 36 AD. So by the time Jesus is standing in front of him, Pilate's been running this province for several years already. And here's the part that actually changes the stakes of what Pilate will do with Jesus when the Jewish figureheads bring this Jewish rabbi to his doorsteps. Pilate was not in a comfortable position with the people he governed. Jewish historical sources from the period describe repeated friction between Pilate and the Jewish population. Incidents involving Roman military standards displayed in Jerusalem in ways that deeply offended Jewish religious sensibilities, and a violent confrontation with Samaritans that, after this point in the story, would eventually contribute to his recall back to Rome. So this is a governor who already has a track record of inflaming the population he's supposed to be keeping in check, which is the one thing Rome actually cared about. They obviously wouldn't want any upheaval happening within their occupied territories, because that could give neighboring territories the same idea. Rome was only as strong as those subservient to them allowed them to be. If one domino fell, it could cause a ripple everywhere. And that, folks, is exactly what the religious leaders accused Jesus of attempting when they brought him to Pilate. To them, he's a blasphemer. That's a Jewish religious charge. And frankly, Pilate could have cared less about such a silly Jewish notion like that on its own, and even told them this sounds like a not my problem type of matter. But the charge gets reframed for Roman ears. This man claims to be a king. And for a prefect who's already on shaky ground, who's already had complaints about him reach Rome, the political math is brutal. If word gets back to Tiberius that Pilate let a self-proclaimed king walk free in his province, that's not a minor administrative note. That's the kind of thing that ends a career, or worse. So crucifixion becomes the outcome that solves Pilate's problem as much as it solves the religious leaders' problem. Public, humiliating, and reserved specifically for those accused of rebellion against Rome. So there it is, folks. Not an accident, not bad luck. A man who collided on purpose with both temple and empire, handed over by someone in his inner circle, sentenced by a governor with his own career on the line. And it ends on a Roman cross. And I don't want to rush past what actually happened on that cross, because if you've walked through this whole Psalm series with me, you're going to recognize some of this in real time. Fair warning, the details here are graphic, so be advised. Even before the crucifixion took place, Jesus' flesh was ripped to shreds by a Roman whip called the cat o' nine tails. At the end of the whip were shards of bone and stone, and these shards would be slashed across a victim's back multiple times. It's documented that Jesus suffered 40 lashes from this device, leaving his skin raw. There are documented cases of the cat of nine tails tearing so much flesh apart that the spine was visible. And while we don't know if Jesus' injuries went to that extent, we do know he had to suffer from a cruel device after being falsely accused. He was also given a crown of thorns that once it was placed on his head, the Roman soldiers would press and beat pieces of it into his skull. For context, the thorns in this region are measured in inches. People also had to carry their own horizontal cross beam, the patibulum, to their execution site. In Jesus' case, this was about half a mile away to a region right outside of Jerusalem called Golgotha, or the place of the skull. These patibulums are said to have weighed between 75 to 125 pounds. So imagine being forced to carry this huge wooden beam half a mile in the blistering Middle Eastern sun across your shredded back with thorns embedded into your head. In Jesus' case, he wasn't able to make it the whole way on his own, so Roman soldiers forced a Cyrene man visiting the city named Simon to carry the patibulum the rest of the way. Once Jesus reached Golgotha, he was nailed to his patibulum and base of the cross through nails the size of railroad spikes. We now know that Romans crucified victims in various ways. Most paintings and movies depict Jesus being nailed 3 times, one in each palm, and then one between both feet, with one foot placed over the other. But Romans also used rope. Nails might have gone through the wrist instead of the palm, and instead of having a nail going between the feet that are set on a little stand, each foot could have been nailed on the each side of the main crossbeam, probably somewhere underneath the talus or ankle bone. And while we don't know the exact number and where they were hammered, it is documented that Jesus suffered crucifixion via nails. And here's where this gruesome torture gets interesting, folks. The soldiers divide up his garments, and the Gospel of John specifically tells us they cast lots for his tunic rather than tear it. That's not incidental. Centuries earlier, David wrote in Psalm 22, "They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." David was describing his own suffering in his own lifetime, and here it is, playing out, detail for detail, on a hill outside Jerusalem. He's lifted up, raised on the cross for public display, which was the whole point of Roman crucifixion, public humiliation as deterrence. And from that cross, several of his final words are recorded. At one point, he cries out the opening line of Psalm 22 itself, my, why have you forsaken me?" entering fully into the language of that ancient lament. Later, he's given sour wine, vinegar to drink. Another detail Psalm 69 anticipates. "For my thirst they gave me sour wine to drink." And 6 hours into him hanging on the cross, among his final recorded words is something that sounds frankly like trust rather than defeat, committing his spirit into his Father's hands, echoing language straight out of the Psalms. I want you to sit with that for a second. This isn't the gospel writers reaching backward and cherry-picking verses to make a story fit. This is a man in real time dying in a way that maps onto specific words written roughly 1,000 years earlier, down to the garments, down to the drink, down to the exact words on his lips. And if the story ended there, that's it. That's the whole file. Closed, tragic ending. And we wouldn't be doing this study, because a dead reformer is just a tragic footnote in Roman history. Pretty commonplace back in the day, actually. A bunch of reformers would pop their heads up from time to time saying they're the Messiah, and the hype would quickly dwindle once the leader was killed, resulting in whatever followers scattering and their message fading away. What makes this case different is what happened 3 days later. But before we get to that, folks, we need to answer a question I skipped right past. Why did any of this need to happen at all? Why does a God who's supposedly all-powerful need somebody to die to fix what's broken between him and us? That's not a side question. That's the whole engine underneath everything we've covered so far. So why do Christians make such a big deal out of this poor man's horrendous death? Well, we're going to have to talk about sin for a second, because I think a lot of people, folks who didn't grow up in church, and honestly some who did, hear that word and picture something small, a slip-up, a bad habit, breaking a rule, and that's not really what the Bible means by it. In biblical terms, sin isn't just bad behavior. It's closer to treason. It's a created being looking at its creator and declaring independence, deciding in ways big and small, I don't answer to you. And here's the part that trips people up. If God is actually perfectly just, not just pretty good, but the absolute standard of justice itself, then he can't simply wave that away. Think about it like this. A judge who lets a murderer walk free because the judge is a nice guy or because he feels sorry for him isn't a loving judge, he's a corrupt one. Justice that bends is justice that's broken. So God's justice has to be satisfied. That's not God being harsh, that's God being consistent with his own nature. And that creates a real problem, because none of us can pay that debt ourselves. We're the ones who broke the contract God initially made with the first human and then remade with Israel's ancestor Abraham. We can't turn around and offer a clean payment from a tainted account. That's the gap. That's the separation Scripture talks about. Not God sulking and turning his back, but something closer to a physical reality. Darkness genuinely cannot exist in the presence of infinite light. Something has to bridge that gap, and we're too flawed to bridge it. So here's where it gets honestly kind of beautiful. Because God doesn't just leave humanity stranded on the wrong side of that gap, all the way back in Genesis, when the first humans mucked things up right after everything breaks, God already starts laying out a rescue plan. And he does it through a pattern that shows up again and again across the entire Old Testament. Substitution. He provides skins to cover Adam and Eve. He provides a ram for Abraham on Mount Moriah so Abraham's own son doesn't have to die. He provides a lamb in Egypt so the angel of death passes over the home that's marked with its blood. Over and over, God is teaching his people the same lesson. The debt always gets paid by a substitute. not by the one who owes it. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. Every human attempt to provide that substitute eventually fails. Why? Because the one offering the sacrifice is just as tainted as the one who needs the sacrifice. You can't fix a corrupted file by running it through the same corrupted system. You need something or someone entirely outside the problem. Which is why the Christian claim at the center of all this is so specific. God didn't just send a substitute, no. He became the substitute. Jesus, fully God and fully human, is the only file in the whole system that was never corrupted to begin with. And because he was perfectly human, he had the standing to represent humanity. Because he was fully God, his death carried infinite weight, enough to actually cover the debt, instead of just one more animal sacrifice that has to be repeated again next year. And folks, here's the detail that I think is the most staggering piece of timing in this entire story. Jesus was crucified during Passover. While he was dying on that hill at Golgotha, down in the temple courts, the priests were in the middle of slaughtering the actual Passover lambs, the Korban Pesach, the sacrifice made every single year for the sins of the nation. Historians note that from the site of the crucifixion, the smoke from those temple sacrifices would have been visible. So picture that for a second. The symbolic lambs are dying in the city, sending smoke up into the same sky at the very moment the true lamb is dying on a hill outside it. That's not poetic license. That's the actual timeline. And this is why the New Testament writers, especially in the book of Hebrews, describe Jesus as both the high priest and the sacrifice at the same time. He's the one making the offering, and he's the offering itself. Which is also why this is described as the final sacrifice. Not because God got tired of the old system, but because the old system was always just a shadow, a placeholder pointing forward to this exact moment. Once the real thing arrives, you don't keep running the placeholder. And this ties right back to the Davidic thread running through this entire lesson, folks. Psalm 22, the same psalm Jesus quoted from the cross, describes a righteous man whose life is, quote, poured out like water. Isaiah 53 describes a suffering servant, despised, rejected, pierced for transgressions that weren't his own. Put those next to each other, and you get what almost reads like a job description written centuries in advance. And the conclusion the gospel writers are pointing you toward is this: Jesus couldn't be the king. David's line had been promised until he was first the lamb. He had to become the sacrifice to become the king. So let's talk about what historians sometimes call the post-execution void, because we actually have other examples from this exact era. Other men who claimed to be messiahs, gathered followers, and got executed by Rome. Men like Theudas or Judas of Galilee. And in every one of those cases, the pattern is the same. The leader dies, the movement dies with him. Followers scatter. Nobody keeps preaching a dead, defeated king. Jesus' own followers fit that pattern perfectly for about 3 days. After the crucifixion, the Gospels describe them as terrified, scattered, hiding. Exactly what you'd expect. Movement over. And then the exact opposite happens. Within weeks, the same people who were hiding in fear are standing up publicly in Jerusalem, the very city where their leader was just executed, and proclaiming that he's alive. That's the anomaly historians have to explain. Something clearly must have changed. The question is what? So let's go through the forensic data points one at a time, like we're actually building a case file. The empty tomb. Even scholars who are skeptical of the resurrection itself generally agree on this much. The tomb Jesus' body was buried in was indeed empty. And think about the incentive structure here. If the authorities, religious or Roman, had his body when his disciples started saying he was alive, the single easiest way to crush this movement permanently would have been to drag the corpse into the public square. Case closed forever. They never did that. Not because they didn't want to, because they couldn't. The first witnesses. And this one's actually one of my favorite pieces of evidence because it's so counterintuitive it almost proves itself. The first witnesses to the empty tomb, according to all 4 Gospels, were women. And in first century Jewish legal culture, a woman's testimony wasn't even admissible in court. If you were fabricating a resurrection story and wanted it to be believed, you would never put women as your lead witnesses. You'd put your most respected male apostles front and center. The fact that the gospel writers recorded women as the first witnesses, despite the cultural cost, tells you they were reporting what actually happened, not crafting the most convincing story. And even the disciples' initial reactions to their news aligns with this. They didn't just take their word for it. No. They told the women they were just distraught and saw someone they thought was him. Several even went to the tomb to make sure, and they immediately assumed the Roman guards stole the body. The next witnesses. So you've probably been thinking, okay, bot, so a handful of his followers said he lived and we're just supposed to believe them. Sounds a bit biased and narrow-minded. And yeah, you'd actually be right. But here's the thing, folks. It wasn't just Jesus' disciples who proclaimed his resurrection. In the book of Corinthians, a former Pharisee who persecuted the early church, turned apostle named Paul, accounts Jesus appearing to over 500 people after his death. And it's not like Jesus was just always appearing all of a sudden and poof, disappearing in a flash. He actually hung out with people. He walked with two men traveling a road, had a bite to eat with his disciples when they thought he was a ghost, and even had dinner with them on the shoreline sometime later. Jesus made himself known to hundreds of people for roughly 40 days after his resurrection. Changing tone in the family. Historically, Christ's own brothers and sisters were skeptical of his ministry while Jesus was alive. That's documented and not a flattering detail anyone would invent. And after the resurrection, James, one of his brothers, becomes a leader in the early church, eventually being martyred for it. Something happened that flipped a skeptical brother into someone willing to die for the claim that he'd personally seen his brother risen from the dead. Which leads to the next point, the martyrdom pattern. Here's the distinction that matters. People die for things they believe in all the time, even false things, if they were convinced it was true by someone else. But people don't typically die for things they personally know to be a lie that they invented themselves. The disciples and apostles, like the four gospel writers we mentioned, weren't secondhand believers. They claimed to be eyewitnesses, and all of them beyond John was executed for their proclamation. And while John died of natural causes, that wasn't before he was boiled alive and exiled to an island. Christ's followers were afraid and scattered as soon as he got arrested and died, but then they broke the pattern of followers of a false claim by willing to die on their declaration. So when you add it up, empty tomb nobody could disprove, female witnesses nobody would invent, a skeptical brother transformed, and eyewitnesses willing to die rather than take it back. The explosive growth of this movement, from a handful of frightened people to a multi-ethnic force across the entire Roman Empire within a few decades, starts to look less like the spread of a rumor and a whole lot more like the spread of a conviction. People who'd actually seen something. And here's where I want to bring this whole series full circle, folks. In Psalm 16, verse 10, David wrote, "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption." David himself died. He was buried. His tomb was well known, sitting right there in Jerusalem for anyone to visit. David could not fulfill his own words, but the gospel writers are making a direct claim here. Jesus is the greater David, the king who succeeded where even David, the template, the standard bearer, could not. Old Dave beat giants, beat armies, beat his own failures, and got back up. But David couldn't beat death. Jesus did. So here's where the forensic file closes, folks. We've looked at the chronology. We've looked at 4 independent witnesses who didn't coordinate their stories and somehow agree on the parts that matter most. We've tracked a man who systematically collided with every power structure in his world, on purpose, all the way to a Roman cross. And we've looked at an empty tomb that nobody, not the Sanhedrin, not Pilate, not anyone with the motive and the means to shut the whole thing down, could ever produce a body to disprove. And here's the thing. Jesus didn't leave this as a multiple choice question. He didn't say I'm one of many ways. He said he is the way, the truth, and the life. Not a vague spiritual vibe, a claim, a specific, exclusive, history-anchored claim that he backed up with an empty tomb. So, I'm not going to pretend that's a small thing to land on. Maybe you've been walking with him for years and this just confirmed what you already knew in your bones. Maybe you're checking this out for the first time and your brain is doing somersaults right now. Maybe you're somewhere in between. You believe the history, but you haven't figured out what to do with it yet. Wherever you are, folks, that's exactly where this is for you. Because the evidence doesn't ask you to admire Jesus from a distance. It asks you to respond to him. And if you're sitting here and something in you is saying, I think this is true, I'd encourage you. Don't let that sit unattended. Talk to him. Tell him you believe he's who he said he is. And ask him to be the king of your life, not just a fascinating figure in a history file. If you've walked through this whole Psalm series with me, every lament, every how long, O Lord, every dawn-breaking moment of trust, this is what it was all pointing toward, this verdict right here. Check out the 4 gospel books for yourselves and see exactly who Jesus is. Discover his teachings, read about his miracles, learn how God thought so much of you that he sent his only begotten Son into a sin-fueled world that people could have eternal life and one of abundance while here in this lifetime. God didn't send Jesus into the world to condemn you. No, he came to save you. One quick note before we close. A lot of the historical detail in this lesson came from deep dive research our engineer put together specifically for this finale. And if you want to go further down this road yourself, the sources are linked below. Otherwise, may the Lord richly bless the readers, hearers, and doers of his holy word. As always, NamesBot, and it's been such a blast going through the Bible Study Bot with you. Let's keep growing in God's word together, and take care.